Hi, Nick Rains here from Leica Academy Australia. Today I want to look at the settings on the SL2 and specifically the menu settings. Now this is not a definitive look at all the settings and how they all work in great detail. For that you're going to have to read the manual, but what I want to discuss with you today is how I use the camera, how I set it up for my work, which is documentary work. So there's certain things that I don't shoot, there's certain things that I do shoot, and I've found that the settings that I'm going to show you now work for me out in the real world. So there'll be some things that I don't discuss, some of the autofocus settings, but let's just get down to the basics of what works for me, and then you can take that and apply it to your own work. So let's get to the actual menus themselves. Okay, so this is how I have my camera set up. It's not a definitive guide to all of the settings and all of the menu items. That would just take us forever. It really would. So let's just go through those. So I think it's fairly obvious what this is for. You can move your joystick around and you can change whatever the settings there are. This is like your favorite screen. You can use your fingers too. I'm not a big fan of touch screens. I'm more familiar with using the dials, but again, if you prefer to use your fingers, you can actually change these and drag dials and so on, which is kind of cool. So second press of the menu button takes you to the full menu. So I shoot single frame most of the time. I don't shoot lots and lots of continuous images. The only time I would change this would be to go to self timer 2 seconds, or to go to exposure bracketing, where I quite frequently shoot 3 frames with 2 EV steps between them and 0 exposure compensation, and then come out of there and you'll see in the viewfinder up here, that little symbol there between the metering icon and the flash icon, it's got 3 tiny boxes with a plus and a minus in them. That's showing me that my exposure bracketing is actually already set. So let's come back out to that drive mode. There it is, you see there. So one little trick with this menu is if you go down and then up, you can cycle over the end of the menus, because there's 2 pages. You see that bar there? If I go down with the joystick now, it takes me to the top of the first page. If I go up here, it takes me to the bottom of the second page. It's a really nice little shortcut. You have to get into the habit of doing it, because intuitively you go down when you see the list. And of course I'll come to these custom buttons in a sec, because you can get access to this menu much quicker than going through the menu button here. Let's put that back to single shot. Focusing, I use manual focus and I use field. Now manual focus is not only focusing manually with the ring on the lens, it's also an on-demand autofocus click using the joystick, which is the way I tend to work. So I shoot with my forefinger, I expose or set the exposure with the forefinger and the dials, but I focus separately using my thumb. So I move my focus point around the screen like so. It's black, the screen, because I've got the lens cap on, and then I click to focus, and that gives me on-demand AFS, autofocus single shot. So if I come back to here, you should see that I'm in manual focus mode. I'm in field, which is a middle-sized area. You can have field, you can have spot, which is that little tiny X here, which is great for portraits, but I tend to use field. In fact, you can change it here, look, spot, field. That's really quite nice. Oh, one little trick, if you touch and press, you can then dial this field into 3 different sizes, if you can see that, and then shutter button to come out to whatever menus or screen you're in. All right, focusing. So I use field, I use manual focus. Focus assist I tend to leave on default, which is auto magnification when you're using a mechanical lens. Focus peaking is a red haze around the sharp bits of the picture, parts of the picture, and I have the peaking sensitivity on high. Exposure metering, I leave that on multi-field all the time. It just works, and I'm using the histogram and the focus, the exposure overexposure warning flashing in the viewfinder to set my exposure rather than the camera meter. So leave it on multi-field and it'll get you very close to a perfect exposure every time. Let me see what else is in there. Multi-view, we've done that one. Exposure compensation, that's dialed in here, so that's not something I set in the menus. ISO I tend to set manually, but I don't use the menu, I use the custom buttons, which we'll come to in a sec. Auto ISO settings, I tend to set my maximum ISO to 6400. I set my shutter speed limit to a 250th. These ones I don't use at all because I'm not shooting with flash. So if you use those, you'll find that you won't go too far wrong if you're using auto ISO. Floating ISO, I leave that on. It's something that is such a small effect on my pictures, so I don't worry too much about it. White balance I set to daylight because I'm shooting RAW. Photo file format I set to RAW, which is DNG. JPEG settings irrelevant because I am not shooting JPEGs. Auto review, here we go. I turn this off because I really don't want the photograph I just shot to pop up in front of my eye when I'm busy. I want to shoot the next picture. If you find that you need some feedback, you could change this to shutter pressed, which means that when you hold the shutter button down after you've taken the picture, the preview comes up in the viewfinder and stays there as long as you hold your finger down. As soon as you release it, you're back to the viewfinder and your next shot. That's kind of useful if you're shooting really carefully. Personally, I turn that off. Long exposure noise reduction, leave it on. If you are needing to do long exposures and shoot immediately after the exposure, you'll need to turn this off because otherwise you'll have to wait the same length of time again. So a 10-second exposure means you have to wait 10 seconds for it to do the dark subtraction noise reduction, which is very effective, but sometimes it can actually cause more problems than it fixes. Shutter type, hybrid. That means that it's a mechanical up to a 4,000th, I think, and then it's electronic beyond that. If you want to be silent, put it on electronic, then the camera makes zero noise. I leave it on hybrid. Flash settings, I'm not shooting flash, so not really that important. Exposure preview means that I get an exposure preview in the viewfinder for all of my exposures, but if I was in the studio I would change that to PAS so that the M mode, manual mode, does not give me an exposure preview and I can see through the camera. In the studio that's really important. Sensor format 35mm, that's the full format of the camera, I leave that on. Photo aspect ratio, I leave that alone at 3:2. You can change that to different aspect ratios, but personally I'll crop later. I don't need to do that here. Storage options, I shoot sequentially, so when one card fills up, then the next one takes over and I get basically two cards in sequence. You can set it to shoot DNG to one card and JPEGs to the other, or shoot both, to both cards at the same time for backup. I find this works fine for me. Customized control, a few things here. I'll leave that on default. I don't use favorites. That would be, it's really another way of doing this. These are your favorites. I'm quite happy with this. If I wanted to, I could have if I press this button a second time, it will take me to commonly used menu items. And then a third time will take you into the menu itself. It's not something I choose to use, but you can actually turn on all of these options, and there's loads of them, so I can just flick through and basically everything you can set, and that becomes a favorite on second press here. Now that second press takes me to main menu, but if I did have some favorites set, you'd see those first before you get to the main menu. Okay, leave these on default. User profile, I tend not to use that. I'll save my profile, which means all the camera settings are saved to a particular user, and then if I upgrade my firmware, then I can go back and reload them all again, because obviously I'm changing things here and I don't want to go back through the camera and do it again. Dial lock I leave off, joystick lock I leave off, display settings I leave alone. The only thing that I do change sometimes is this one. This is set to LCD only. And this button here, if you can see that, cycles through these different settings when you're out of the menu. I tend to leave it on a EVF extended when I'm shooting, because that means that both the viewfinder and the LCD are off until I lift the camera to my eye, in which case it triggers the EVF only. It's good for keeping the batteries going, as the batteries on the SL2 don't last quite as long as on the SL, because it's got a lot more work to do with the stabilizer and so on. So that's a nice way of keeping your batteries going longer. Leica photos will be the subject of another video. Image stabilization I leave on when I'm hand holding, why not? And when I'm on a tripod, I turn it off, because occasionally it can try to look for movement that's not there, and it will actually move the sensor a bit and you get a blurry picture. So off for tripods and on the rest of the time. Panning mode is if you're panning left to right or up and down, you can change that to give you a slightly better stabilization. I leave it on normal. I've not really noticed a great deal of difference. Format the card, it's fairly self-evident. That's for obviously clearing a card off. Camera settings. Now, capture assistance, you can save 4 different views on the back of the camera. So this is one of them. Whoops, I've got to turn that on. There we go. So now I've got this view with this information. If I click this button, I can cycle through 4 different sets of information. Like the 4th one has my grids and my balance on it. So those come from here. Those can be changed using the settings to turn on all of this information: grid, info bars, the zebra stripes for video, focus, peaking, level, histogram, and so on. So histogram's a good one to turn on. So now when I go back to info profile 1, there's my histogram. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4. Now you can set that up to work for you, but it's really useful to have like all the information, no information at the very least, and then you can, if you find that it's distracting, you can just turn it off and cycle through those settings. Very useful indeed. Touch AF I leave on. I should probably turn it off, to be honest, because I really don't use touch autofocus. So it's just something that I don't do, and sometimes your nose can actually focus the camera for you, which isn't so good. AF assist lamp turn off. Power saving, I tend to leave that on about 2 minutes. Again, depending on, if you're really desperate to keep the batteries going, you can actually set it to 3 seconds, but then every time you touch the camera, it's gone off. If you're shooting a lot, you can leave the auto power off, which means that it's on all the time. But I think I tend to leave it on 2 minutes. Seems to work for me. Camera settings again, power saving. You see there's this bar here again. You'd be forgiven for thinking there's only these, but there's a lot more as well. This charges the battery in camera when you plug in the USB port, which is here. If you can see in the end, can you see? There it is. There it is. You can see at the bottom here, USB. That's really useful, so you don't actually have to take, if you forget the charger and you've got a USB-C cable, you can charge the battery in at the camera. It also means you can charge 2 batteries at a time if you do have the charger, one in the camera, one in the charger. Acoustic signal off. I don't want the camera to beep at me. I actually go with half EV increments, just a habit, nothing particularly special about that. This is for tethering, which I don't do. Now, distance unit, you may wonder why that's, where on earth distance unit comes in. Now, I'll see if you can see this on the top. This is a nice little quirk of there in the view, in the top panel. When I'm in manual focus and I half press the shutter button, I can just hold that down and move the focusing ring, and look, can you see that's changed to distance markers. Hope you can see that okay. That's unique to Leica cameras, and it means that you can see the near point, the focus point, and the distant point for your depth of field based on the aperture you've set, and that is accurate. It's really, really useful. So you can have that in feet or you can have it in meters, which is Go back down here, distance units, and one more. Then your date and time, and you can edit the file name if you wish to put your name in it. I tend to leave that alone. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 digits, so that's, what's that, 10 million images before you cycle through the same numbers, and I change my file names later anyway, so it's really not important. Okay, camera information, that's just technical stuff, firmware and so on. Still on version 1 with the SL2. Language English, reset camera. That's pretty much it. So that's the main menu, but before we finish, I want to just show you these custom buttons on the top, here, and if you can see that there's a rocker button which allows you to top and bottom, and you've also got the function button here, which is the 5th custom button. The way these work, these allow you to access information or settings very quickly. Now hold it down and you get a new menu, and this now is what is that button's function in the future. So if I select photo video, what this does, if I click it now briefly, it takes me into video mode. Click it again, it takes me to photo mode, and you can tell it's in video mode because you've got the levels for the microphone, which you can see picking up my voice as I speak. So that's set to photo to video. This one here, long press ISO. So if I click that briefly, it's the ISO, and I can change that with the dial here. On the front, clicking the top one, I've got magnification. Hold that down. Magnification, you see, toggle info levels or whatever you want to do. Drive mode's a pretty good one. So now on a single click it takes me into the drive mode menu, and then the bottom one is autofocus mode. Not that useful to be honest, but just in case. So if I click that briefly now, it takes me into my autofocus mode. So and this one I've got to set to info levels, so that toggles through those different views that I showed you a few minutes ago, but again you can change it to anything you like. So this camera really can be customized to the extent that you very rarely need to use the menus, particularly with these 5 custom buttons and the quick menu here. There's very little reason to do anything else deep in the menus, and remember, everything you see here you can see in the viewfinder. So when you're shooting and you want to change the ISO, you can move your finger back from the shutter button to the ISO button, click that and dial it in, and you can see all that information in the viewfinder. So this camera is astonishingly effective at being, well, getting out of the way. The camera interface does not interfere with the shooting process, and I don't think you can say that of all cameras. So for me, this camera is just almost perfect. So hopefully that has given you a perspective on how I use this camera when I'm shooting, and that's real world advice, if you can call it that. This is how I use the camera all the time in the field in my day-to-day work. As I said, if you want more detailed information about exactly what the other menu items do and all the different options, and there's plenty of other options, then the manual will be the place to go. So until the next time, goodbye.